They're two of the greatest artists of the 16th century. Lucas Cranach, known as the Elder, and his son, also named Lucas Cranach. They ran the most prolific workshop of their time, painting more and faster than any of their contemporaries. The Protestant reformer Martin Luther was a close friend, and the Cranachs became the painters of the Reformation. Born at the end of the Middle Ages, the artists lived and made their fortune in a world that was rapidly changing. Both father and son embody ideas associated with the term Renaissance, a time of revival and upheaval in art. The Cranachs' works have been studied by generations of scholars, but many questions remain unanswered. Gunnar Heydenreich and Ingo Sandner are art historians and restorers. Here in Merseburg Cathedral, they're studying an altarpiece that came from the Cranach workshop in the year 1537. Who painted it? Is it the work of Cranach the Elder or the Younger? Or was it done by a workshop assistant? Using an infrared camera, the historians revealed the underdrawing that normally cannot be seen. The signature style may tell them who did the work.
With this camera, we can look deep into the picture, beneath the visible layer of paint, and expose the artist's sketch. We're now taking a close-up of this section of the painting so we can examine it more closely.
The altarpiece is one of many from Lucas Cranach the Elder's workshop that was executed according to his instructions, but not by the master himself. Cranach the Elder's unprecedented career had begun 30 years earlier. By now he was painting familiar motifs in a new way. His saints wore fashionable jewelry and were surrounded by realistic natural scenes. It was a new view of the world and the people in it. Around 1500, Wittenberg on the river Elbe was dominated by the spires of All Saints Castle Church and St. Mary's Town Church. One of the mightiest rulers of the Holy Roman Empire, the Elector of Saxony, had a residence here. Frederick III, known as Frederick the Wise, was a patron of the arts who dreamed of an intellectual awakening in his realm. A Renaissance with a Saxon touch.
Elector Frederick the Wise had several residences. Wittenberg was one of them. But he also lived in Lochau. He also lived in Dresden. You mustn't think that Elector Frederick was here every day. But he was immensely important for the town because he founded the university. You could say that without the university there wouldn't have been a Reformation. The main reformers were professors at the university.
Frederick established the University of Wittenberg, known as Alma Mater Leucaria, in 1502. With it, Wittenberg was to become a center of the arts and sciences. The Elector brought humanist scholars to town. Humanism was a new mindset that strove to revive the cultural legacy of antiquity and emphasized intellectual freedom.
It's quite amazing to think of what a small town this was. The big cities were Leipzig, Erfurt, Nuremberg, but Wittenberg? Even though it was a royal residence, even though it had a university, it was a small town with around 2,500 inhabitants, dominated by students and professors. There were lots of craftsmen, lots of printers. And that's the fascinating thing about it. When you came to this town, you discovered so much skill, so much competence. That was Wittenberg's good fortune in the 16th century, that so many talents came together at the same time in the same place.
In 1505, Elector Frederick appointed Lucas Cranach his court painter in Wittenberg. At first, Cranach worked in the elector's castle, earning a yearly salary of 100 gulden. That's the equivalent of about 100,000 euros today.
Frederick the Wise offered him a yearly salary that was equal to that of a professor at Wittenberg University at the time, as well as a supplement for works commissioned by the court. So he had achieved a very respectable and prestigious position.
One of the primary duties of the court painter was to depict the ruling Saxon dynasty. The ruler's portrait had to hang in every castle and government office. Cranach painted the German prince's life-sized and conquering pose with ceremonial regalia, like the elector's crown, ermine coat, and sword. He also painted them at the hunt, at weddings, and other important occasions. He documented the splendor, the aspirations, and importance of the ruling house of Saxony. Another of his duties was to supervise the decorations of the tournaments at the Wittenberg marketplace. First, the square was covered with sand. Then the jousters and onlookers came, and the court painter, Lucas Cranach, recorded the spectacle as a woodcut. On his arrival in Wittenberg, Cranach encountered artworks by other painters. The court frequently commissioned works by a celebrated contemporary of Cranach's, the Nuremberg artist Albrecht Dürer. The two were to become major rivals. A Head of Christ by Jacopo de Barbari. The Venetian artist was Cranach's predecessor as court painter and had brought new impulses from Italy. A new kind of portraiture was developing, one in which the subject seemed to live and breathe compared with the stiff, stylized earlier depictions. The painter Sandro Botticelli depicted the Virgin Mary as a beautiful, fashionably dressed woman. He gave the nude painting of the Roman love goddess Venus the erotic aura of sculptures from classical antiquity. Cranach had encountered this art during his travels in Italy.
Cranach is often criticized for ignoring the art of the Italian Renaissance, and it's said that he couldn't rival it. But we know today that he was very well informed about what was going on in Italy around 1500. He also grappled with it intensely, but he continuously discovered his own style, one that today seems more modern than what was being produced in Italy.
Soon after coming to Wittenberg, Cranach painted a picture of the Virgin Mary for the castle church. In what's now known as the Dessau altarpiece of the princes, Mary and the infant Jesus are flanked by two saints. On the wings are naturalistic renditions of Frederick the Wise on the left, and on the right his brother John the Steadfast. They're shown in the typically medieval pose of worship. The real surprise is the way Cranach shows Mary, looking directly out of the picture at the viewer. The Mother of God has been made flesh and blood, one of us, human. Just a few years earlier, such a depiction would have been unthinkable. The output of the Cranach's workshop was prolific. Around 1,500 works attributed to the father or son are still known today. Since 2009, scholars and museums from more than 100 countries have been publishing information about the works on a freely accessible internet platform, the Cranach Digital Archive. Gunnar Heydenreich, who is a professor at the Cologne University of Applied Sciences, heads the project. Based on this woodcut by Albrecht Dürer, The Martyrdom of St. Catherine, he demonstrates the rivalry between the two most successful painters of their time. The expert draftsman Dürer completed the work in 1498. 8 years later, Cranach used it as a role model for his version of the same motif.
He spent a lot of time on the fine graphic details and thereby entered into direct competition with Dürer. He reflected Dürer's detailed drawing in his painting and spent a particularly long time making this painting as rich in detail as possible.
The martyrdom of St. Catherine was a popular subject at the time. Cranach, like Baroque artists many years later, turned it into a dramatic spectacle, an earthly version of the fall of the rebel angels motif, with the humans lurching beneath a sky rent asunder. As far as their contemporaries were concerned, the contest between Cranach and Dürer ended without a clear victor. Dürer's works were admired, but Cranach's were more popular. Much about the life of Lucas Cranach the Elder remains a mystery to this day. Little is known about the painter's childhood and youth. He's believed to have been born on October 4th, 1472 in Cranach, in the southern German region of Franconia. He probably received his training in his father's workshop, since his father was also a painter. The Cranach monument in Cranach marks the spot where the family house once stood. Lucas left home early on, presumably to travel as a journeyman. He called himself Cranach after his hometown Cranach, but then all trace of him is lost for some years. Around 1500 he emerged as a painter in Vienna, a major city in the Holy Roman Empire and the imperial administrative seat. Here Cranach received commissions and painted his first known works. Among them the wedding portrait for the rector of the university, the humanist Johannes Cuspinian, and his wife Anna. Cranach's arrangement of the pictures was new, placing his subjects in relation to an atmospheric landscape full of symbolism. The elements of fire, water, earth, and air stand for the world yet to be discovered. The wedding couple's education is indicated by the parrot in the background. The bird of the genus Ara comes from Brazil, a country that Europeans had discovered just 2 years earlier. Cranach's Viennese works show him to be an accomplished painter with a personal style. He signed them Lucas Cranach, Lucas from Cranach. A few years later in Wittenberg, a fateful encounter occurred when the theology professor Martin Luther met the court painter Lucas Cranach. The two men would change not only the church, but the world in which they lived. They quickly became friends. Church and religion were important to Cranach, as they were for everyone in his time.
You have to keep in mind that the church and civil society were intertwined. There wasn't any separation. You were a citizen of the community and at the same time a member of the church parish. The two merged entirely. So, of course, everyone in Wittenberg was a member of the church community. Everyone was a Christian, a Catholic Christian. The church was absolutely defining.
But the world, as defined by the Catholic Church, was changing. On October 31st, 1517, Martin Luther is said to have nailed his 95 theses to the door of the castle church. Regardless of how he actually posted them, his protests against the sale of indulgences and other abuses in the Catholic Church catalyzed a schism within Christianity in Western Europe. Lucas Cranach the Elder became the painter of the Reformation in Germany. He found the right images to convey a new, direct, and personal relationship between the individual and God.
Cranach influenced the Reformation by providing the images for it. He conveyed the theology in pictures and brought reformative ideas into the world. Sometimes I think they talked about it. They did live very close to each other. I think they influenced each other in the spirited exchanges that were taking place in Wittenberg.
The town church of St. Mary's on Wittenberg's Market Square is the mother church of the Reformation. Before long, services were being held in the German language, not in Latin, as were baptisms.
Ich taufe dich im Namen des Vaters, des Sohnes und des Heiligen Geistes.
Martin Luther and other Wittenberg reformers preached famous sermons here. The altarpiece is a major example of Cranach's Reformation artworks. It's a monumental depiction of the Last Supper, a late work from the year 1547. Instead of including worshipful Catholic donors and saints in the work, real-life figures of the Reformation have been made part of the narrative. The central panel depicts the Last Supper with Jesus and his apostles. The bearded apostle on the right of the picture, turning outward, is Martin Luther. He's accepting a beaker of wine from a servant with the features of Cranach the Younger. The left panel shows Luther's friend and fellow reformer Philip Melanchthon at a baptism. The right panel features another Wittenberg reformer, Johannes Bugenhagen, in the confessional. Cranach painted actual people of his time into the biblical action. The message was clear. The teachers of the Reformation sensed a deep connection to Jesus Christ as the head of the church.
My favorite Cranach painting is the altarpiece in Wittenberg's town church. It's so touching that they are all there. Luther himself is there, and right in the midst of their life in Wittenberg. Those in Wittenberg experience the word of the Bible, confession, Eucharist, baptism, as part of their own lives. I think they really saw themselves there.
In 1525, when Martin Luther married the former nun Katharina von Bora, Lucas Cranach was his witness.
They must have had a very close relationship. They were witnesses to each other's marriages. They were godfathers to each other's children. In fact, it's quite possible that Luther met his wife at the Cranachs. When Katharina von Bora fled from the cloister, she had nowhere to stay. The Cranachs took her in, and she lived there for several years, and it seems that Luther met and fell in love with her there.
Wittenberg was the starting point of the Reformation, and Cranach portrayed the reformer. His works show an energetic man who not only proclaims his teachings, but lives by them entirely. First, we see the stern, ascetic Augustine monk with his clerical tonsure. Then Luther in hiding at Wartburg Castle, posing as a nobleman named Jörg, or as the defender of the doctrine, wearing his university cap. Later, the portraits show Luther's affirmation of the world, of marriage and worldly authority. The reformer is stouter, more mature. Cranach made Martin Luther the icon of the Reformation. After a few years in Wittenberg, Lucas Cranach started a family. In 1512, he married a mayor's daughter and had 5 children with her. They named their second son Lucas. The elder Cranach had experienced a meteoric rise. He bought houses, ran a successful wine tavern, and the only pharmacy in town on the market square. Soon he was the richest burgher in Wittenberg. He served on the city council for decades and even became mayor. He lived in an imposing building in the center of town. In the workshop in the back, he ran a flourishing business with a team of master and journeyman painters. Here, apprentices were trained, and a stream of visitors came and went. Cranach the Elder ran an impressive household. The prince of painters was a canny businessman and a confident citizen of the town.
We're here in the middle of this large ensemble at Schlossstrasse number 1. That belonged to Cranach the Elder. He lived here in the front part, a huge house with lots of rooms where the Danish king once stayed with his entourage. It was a very grand house. The most important thing in this ensemble is over there, where the workshop was. In this building, there in the back. This was the Cranach workshop, which is where Cranach the Younger learned his trade, where he grew up. You can imagine his life here. He grew up in the workshop and ultimately became the head of it.
Cranach and his staff not only produced pictures for the nobility and churchmen. In the workshop's own printing house, they supplied an entirely new art market, the growing bourgeoisie and its demand for images. Not everyone could afford to buy a painting, but prints were cheaper. So the workshop made woodcuts and produced series of prints from them. The printing technique enabled the artists to bring new themes or portraits onto the market quickly.
This is a gigantic woodcut from the Cranach workshop, a really impressive piece made up of 11 different woodcuts. It wasn't easy at the time to create such a large woodcut, which is why it's in 11 parts. The thrilling thing about this woodcut is that it doesn't always depict Martin Luther. This is the famous reformer, yes, with the Bible in his hand. But the 11th woodcut, which is the head, could be substituted in the Cranach workshop. There are prints with the same body, the same rendering, but with the head of Melanchthon, or with the head of the early reformer Jan Hus. If you want to know how this workshop functioned, the way it produced in series, just take a look at this large woodcut.
In the early years in particular, the workshop produced large numbers of woodcuts, more than the numbers of paintings.
Print was the medium that made it possible to produce works in greater numbers compared to paintings. It was only later that Cranach was able to expand his workshop production in order to put out paintings in similar numbers to the prints that he'd made earlier.
Everything that came out of the workshop was signed with Cranach's personal crest, a winged crowned serpent with a ring in its mouth. The snake symbol was the label by which buyers could recognize the Cranach brand. Was it a work by Cranach the Elder, the Younger, or an apprentice? It was often hard to say. One simply bought a Cranach. The workshop used pigments like these to make its own paints. They were purchased at the big trade fairs in neighboring Leipzig. It turned out to be practical that Cranach owned the pharmacy in Wittenberg. With the so-called apothecary's privilege, he could obtain pigments at wholesale prices, more cheaply than the competition.
The pigments that were already being used back then were mainly earth tones, variously coloured clays that were turned into pigments through a lengthy process of grinding and sieving.
The yellow came from the mines of the Ore Mountain region. The deep blue ultramarine was made by grinding lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. It was not available in Leipzig. In Antwerp, it cost its weight in gold. In 1508, Cranach bought a few grams on a trip to the Netherlands. Soon after that, he painted the Holy Kinship, also known as the Torgau Altar, using the new color. The work in his manufacture was organized down to the last detail.
The grey primer was prepared by mixing the pigment with egg and linseed oil. And it was very important to rub it on a glass slab with a muller like this for a long time. In Cranach's time, that was done for hours. He probably had apprentices whose special job it was to grind the colours.
Cranach had his frames and canvases prepared ahead of time in large numbers in many selected sizes. Then he picked those that corresponded to the wishes of the customer. Popular motifs were produced and stockpiled by the workshop. Soon Cranach was famous not only for the beauty of his works, but because he could provide so many of them. Figures that only needed slight variation were not drawn anew, but traced.
That's done by rubbing the back of the paper template with pigment, with sanguine or red chalk, a red earth pigment. It is then placed on top of the prepared canvas, and the lines are traced with a pointed tool until the pigment is pressed onto the undercoat.
Other painters of the period, like Dürer, also had workshops and assistants, but only Lucas Cranach insisted on a single, recognizable painting style developed by him and adhered to by everyone in his workshop, without exception.
The Cranach workshop was a factory that had no place for individual style or an individual signature. It had a workshop style, and all the workers there painted in the workshop style. So that makes it very, very hard to distinguish between the different hands that worked on the pieces and say, this is the work of Cranach the Younger, or this is by the father.
The famous Reformation altar in the town church of Weimar. For centuries, it was believed to be the elder Cranach's last masterpiece, a major work of Reformation art. But recently, scientists from the Cranach Digital Archive studied it using infrared reflectography and found that it was actually by Cranach the Younger.
This picture must be by Cranach the Younger, because the underdrawing shows his typical stylistic features. Short strokes, often changing direction, almost choppy, sometimes scribbled-looking lines. Cranach the Younger preferred black chalk for the underdrawing, in contrast to his father, who often used black ink and a brush.
What I find so fascinating is the way he seems to have used incredibly fine brushes. He painted details that are so tiny in places that you have to get up close to see that it's actually painted.
Contemporaries marveled at the wondrous speed with which Lucas Cranach completed his paintings. Infrared reflectography reveals how the workshop carried out its monumental commissions. The underdrawing of this painting includes color instructions like red, blue, and so forth. That clearly suggests that the painting was not carried out by the master himself, but that he specified how it was to be painted. For nearly 80 years, the workshop sent the Cranach brand out into the world. Reportedly, it produced around 5,000 paintings. The year 1537 was a turning point. Cranach's eldest son, Hans, died suddenly. From then on, Duchess the Younger became more involved in the workshop, and father and son became equally responsible for the success of the business. Works by the Cranachs are still greatly sought after today and fetch high prices at auctions, but it's rare to find Cranachs for sale on the art market. Every year, the city of Maastricht in the Netherlands hosts the European Fine Arts Fair, a prestigious marketplace for old masters' art. Art dealer Konrad O. Bernheimer has sold the most Cranachs in recent years. What should one look out for when bidding on a Cranach?
With Cranach, just like with Rubens and most of the other great artists, you have to try to distinguish the hands, as the art historians put it. That means really seeing what was done by the hand of the master and what was done by the workshop. In the case of Lucas Cranach the Elder, was it the son or one of the many others? If you study Cranach intensively, then you can sometimes tell by the position of the eyes or the way the fingers are painted. It is possible to differentiate them.
As a dealer, Bernheimer wishes he could find more paintings by the hand of one of the two masters. He can, however, show us one motif that the Cranachs painted in many variants.
This is one of the most popular subjects of that time, the ill-matched couple. It's usually expressed as the combination old man, young woman, but there's also the version of the old woman, young man. In this case, we have the old man and the young woman. He is placing a ring on her finger and is obviously wooing her. She has her right arm around his shoulder, but she's basically looking through him. Yes, it's a popular theme, and it comes up again and again in Cranach's work under the general theme of Weibermacht, the power of women, as it was called. The power that women have over men.
Weibermacht, so hat man das damals bezeichnet, also die Macht, die die Frauen über die Männer haben.
Myths from antiquity and stories from the Bible provided motifs for the popular genre. Pictures like Salome with the head of St. John the Baptist show the dark side of seductive femininity, while providing a pious lesson to the viewer. Some years earlier, Italian artists had rediscovered the female nude. Lucas Cranach the Elder also began to depict naked women and turned the idea into a lucrative line of business. He quickly found motifs from antiquity to suit the new subject. Figures such as Caritas or Lucretia. One erotic motif that Cranach painted in several variations was the nymph of the spring. London art dealer Mark Weiss says he's fortunate to be able to offer one.
Well, it was a painting which we acquired directly from the French noble family who'd had the picture probably for some 100 years. The price of this painting is, in pounds, £3,250,000.
The Duchess Anna Amalia Library in Weimar, one of the world's major historical libraries. Here seen after its recent renovation. In 2004, a fire consumed a large part of the building, destroying tens of thousands of irreplaceable books. During that night, the library director, Michael Knoche, ran into the burning building and risked his life to rescue one work from the flames. The oldest complete Bible in German, translated by Martin Luther and illustrated by the Cranach workshop.
This Luther Bible is the first joint edition of the Old and New Testaments by Martin Luther. It dates from 1534. It's an outstandingly produced object that has beautifully painted illustrations. The Bible has 117 woodcuts that stem from the Cranach workshop. Some are by Cranach himself. The quality of the illustrations and the coloring is unparalleled. This Bible was very important to me, and that's why I took a small risk during the fire to rescue it.
It took Luther and his assistants 13 years to translate both parts of the Bible before they were printed in Wittenberg. The Cranach workshop provided the brilliantly colored illustrations with passages highlighted in gold.
The illustrations appear throughout the entire book. Lots of the initials are colored. Here we have a picture of the creation of the world. God the Father is presenting the state of paradise. We can see Adam and Eve and lots of small animals. You have to remember that these are woodcuts. Each of these fine details had to be cut into the wood.
The Cranachs produced images for Bibles and altars. They filled the churches with their paintings that explain the Reformation. But it wasn't just the religion of their time that was changing dramatically. Soon the Reformation seeped into politics.
In 1546 to 47, the first religious civil war broke out here in Germany. The Catholic imperial troops won and also conquered Wittenberg. Prince-Elector John Frederick was taken prisoner and sent into exile by the emperor. That was a serious break in the life of the workshop. It couldn't get much more serious. The royal court left Wittenberg, and suddenly Cranach the Elder was no longer court painter.
The elder Cranach left Wittenberg and in 1552 joined the elector in his exile and final home in Weimar. There, the artist lived in his daughter's house in the agreeable surroundings on the marketplace in the center of town, where he continued to plan and work. Cranach the Younger made a portrait of his elderly father shortly before his departure. A farewell.
It stands to reason that he would want to have a remembrance of his father here. He painted him with a fur collar, indicating the mayoral role. But it's also a very personal portrait with unique facial features which make a very strong impression.
A year after his arrival in Weimar, Lukas Cranach the Elder died at the age of 81. He was buried in Weimar's Jakobsfriedhof, or St. James Cemetery. The workshop in Wittenberg passed on to Lucas Cranach the Younger. It's only now, 500 years after his birth, that he is also being discovered as an artist in his own right. A precise and sensitive draftsman, a portrait painter to rival his father. He successfully ran the workshop and continued the Cranach brand until his death in 1586.
The business went on. Cranach the Younger didn't change it. He took many of the themes that the workshop had designed, for example, the ones known as pious images and the many portraits of Martin Luther. He took those pictorial formats and he added to them, diversified them. But he didn't change anything.
Erweitert, ergänzt, differenziert, aber hat das nicht geändert.
The younger Cranach completed the Reformation altarpiece in Weimar's town church 2 years after his father's death. In this very personal tribute, the blood of Christ falls on the head of Cranach the Elder. The two friends, Cranach and Luther, stand side by side, the herald of the image next to the herald of the word, and they're shown as equals. The Cranachs were the chief painters of the Reformation, but when Catholic clients commissioned paintings, they didn't refuse. After all, they were artists and businessmen. The Middle Ages were over. The modern era had begun.